Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you today, Ken?
I'm okay, but I'm going to be honest, Rory. I've got a bit of a cold going on at the moment, so if I sound like a deep-voiced country and western singer, that's probably why it is. But I'm 100% here, glad to be here, and Rory and I are both glad that you have joined us for the Counselling Tutor Podcast. It's episode 242. Goodness me, I think my voice gets higher the more episodes we do, Rory. I'm just so surprised that we've made it through so many episodes, so many hours of us chatting and about counselling. And today we're going to be chatting about three different topics. We're starting off with that theory and practice, where we take a piece of theory that we might study or learn during our counselling studies, but we have a look and we see how does that apply in real practice. And today we're speaking about irrational beliefs, going back to those roots, Rory, maybe of CBT. We're then moving on to our practice partner. This is our series where we're looking at going into private practice or being in private practice or improving your private practice. And today we're kind of following on in our series. Up until now, we've kind of looked at the business plan. We've looked at how we might get inquiries by using the directory listings. We've spoken about websites that might generate inquiries. And the next step in that journey is, how do we go from an inquiry to a client booking? So we're going to have a look at that process today. And then we end off today with practice matters. It's a really interesting one, this, Rory. I think that we've had a lot of buzz in the actual Facebook group about this very, very topic. And this is about pre-trial therapy, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely. I caught up with Erene Hadjiioannou, who is a leading exponent of actually helping form and shape the law around what can be, or the guidance of what can be discussed pre-trial when working with a therapist. Honestly, it's really, really not to be missed, Ken.
Well, this is it. This is episode 242. You're at the right place. And we're going to kick off with those irrational beliefs, Rory.
Yes, and irrational beliefs is something that comes up in cognitive therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, or REBT, rational emotive behavioral therapy. And one of the very interesting things is that as human beings, we do have irrational beliefs. And part of CBT is to ask us to question them. So when I was preparing for this podcast, I took a break and had to go up in the loft to find something. And when I was rooting around in the loft, I actually found the exercise that I did when I was doing my diploma in counselling many years ago, 20 years ago, to be honest. And I was asked to write my irrational beliefs down on what was called a questioning irrational beliefs kind of inventory. And I read through it and I thought, oh, Rory, bless you. If I could be there with that 20-year-old, that 40-year-old Rory, I'd put my arm around him and I'd say, oh, Rory. And I feel actually quite shy about sharing this, but I will do in service of showing how irrational and rational beliefs are. It says that on the front of this paper, it says, take your irrational belief and identify the alternative to this belief, which is a rational one. Write them down side by side on a sheet of paper under the appropriate headings: irrational belief and then rational belief. So what's irrational and what's rational? Here we go, Ken. I feel quite embarrassed about this. I am not very academic and will fail at any attempt at further education.
Wow.
And that was the irrational belief. And the rational belief was, although I do find it hard, so do other people. I have attained qualifications and it takes commitment. So that set me on the path of a few other questions being asked. And I won't go through the whole sheet, but step 2 is ask yourself the following question: which belief is true, which belief is false? And I put the irrational belief is false. And then step 3 was write down the answer to this question and provide written answers. And I wrote down, I said, although I find it hard, experience has taught me: 1, what commitments I'm likely to need to accomplish the course; 2, that even the brightest of people are not bright all the time.
Yeah.
3, mistakes are an opportunity to learn, not a paralyzing event that cannot be moved on from. And 4, my writing's got better over the last 20 years. That's a bonus. The first step is half the journey.
Wow.
So what would happen in a CBT interaction with cognitive behavioral therapy is that a therapist might help a client identify their irrational beliefs, like I did on this sheet, and send them away to do some homework and say, use a sheet, fill it in, and come back. We'll have a look and see if there's any other explanation to what can happen. And I'll give you a theory into practice example. Many years ago, when I was a school counsellor, I worked with a number of people, and one of the persons said that they thought that people were looking at them all the time. So I said, well, okay, let's test this hypothesis out. If you were to go into town and when you go shopping, you might look in a shop window, you see the reflections behind you. You can see the goods in the shop on the mannequin, but you might see the reflections behind you. Focus on the reflections and see the people walking past and see if they're staring at you. And the person came back and said, no one was looking at me. So I said, well, what does that tell you? And it was really, really interesting. Now, I'm a person-centered therapist and I didn't train in CBT, but my supervisor suggested that might be a useful intervention. And it was a game changer for the client. It was an absolute game changer because the client then began to realize that what was believed actually wasn't true. It was a perception that could be altered. And that is the whole point of checking out irrational and rational beliefs. It's used a lot in CBT and it can be mightily helpful. It certainly helped me. I can remember doing this form 20 years ago and it was really, really useful. I came away from the session, the teaching session, with a renewed sense of purpose. And I kept it for a number of years when things got tough. I certainly kept it through my training when things got really tough. And I would look at it and go, well, that's what I wrote down. Those are your words, Rory. Stick with it.
Wow.
And here we are. So that is irrational and irrational beliefs, and we all have them. I mean, this is the thing. We all have irrational and irrational beliefs, and sometimes just checking them out against reality is a good experiment in general, I think. Ken?
Wow. Yes, that is really powerful that you shared that, Rory. Thank you very much. I could sense the tentatively going into that and looking back at who you were at that point 20 years ago and comparing that to who you are today. And it's very interesting that your irrational belief that you identified was, I am not very academic and I'm going to fail at the things that I take on. And here today, you are a academic lead. You've been involved with groups that advise other academics. It's an incredible, challenge to that irrational belief. And it's certainly CBT in action, what you described. The lesson was obviously a CBT lesson that you were doing, and they were covering the model of CBT. And in CBT, we have the A, B, C. So that's the actuating event. Something happened in the past. So I'm going to use an example. At school, I maybe didn't do so well at school. And then the belief, and this is the irrational belief, is I then take on a label and I say, I'm not very academic. And then the consequence is that stops me from going into further education, or it kind of stops me learning more, because I will always go back to that irrational belief, the one that you chose, Rory, I'm not very academic. And of course, then there's the D, so it's A, B, C, D, and that is to dispute. And that's what you've spoken about, disputing it by writing it down and then putting in, well, what is the real belief here? Can you identify that's irrational? And what might the real belief be? The real belief in your case being, it's challenging for everybody at times, and I just need to apply myself, which you did, and you came through overcoming that irrational belief. And that is CBT in action 101, I guess. But I'm also recognizing that irrational beliefs do not belong exclusively to CBT. As you mentioned, Rory, that we all have them. And we're going to see them present within our therapy room, whether we're working with the CBT model or REBT model or person-centered or transactional analysis. And I guess I'm interested in, how might we work with an irrational belief that comes from a client within our therapy room if we're not a CBT practitioner. So I guess as a person-centered therapist, we're not going to whip out a pad and paper and start writing things down because it doesn't marry in with the model. And for me, because I certainly have seen this, just by kind of reflecting back and asking the person to tell you more about that, being with them and focusing in a way on what they've just said is a way of kind of challenging that irrational belief for the person themselves, when they go back and maybe look at it in a little bit more detail, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes just having someone in the room, the times clients have said, well, I'm stupid. And I may say to the client, I hear what you say, but you don't come across as a stupid person. Is a challenge within in the person-centered approach, I think, within the person-centered canon. and sometimes just having that, this is how I appear, this is how I appear. Does the client saying, is this how I appear to you? And the therapist giving a congruent answer and saying, well, actually, no, it's not. And that can sometimes be transformational. Again, that's something I've used when I was a child therapist for 7 years. And that's something that happened quite regularly, where a young person would be told something, usually by adults, and usually by adults who are, I don't think they're being cruel, but I think they're being a bit thoughtless, because young people tend to go for absolutes. If you say to a child, oh, you're stupid, then that kind of sticks with them, whereas some adults can kind of shake it off a bit. And they weren't being thoughtful. That's what it was. The person who said these things wasn't being thoughtful about how they approached the young person. And just to have someone say, well, actually, I hear what you're saying, and I know that's how you feel about yourself, but that's not how I experience you, is actually challenging an irrational belief.
Yeah, very much so. It's a different viewpoint on what the person is bringing, and yes, we're going to come across this within our therapy room, and there's kind of a little bit of a chat of how you might identify that and what you might how you might work with that if you're not a CBT therapist. But I think that we can also examine and challenge our own irrational beliefs, and we certainly see irrational beliefs coming up quite a bit in Counselling Tutor in our Facebook group. So somebody might say something like, I'm going into studies, I think I might be too old to go into studies. And that would be challengeable. That's an irrational belief. If you're competent and you're willing to apply yourself, age really is a bit more of an advantage than a disadvantage, I think, when you're going into counseling training, because you have more life experience and a road more traveled or trampled, as they say. And I think that one of the things with an irrational belief is that it can be invisible to self. So when we look from a personal development point of view, sometimes it's difficult to see our irrational beliefs, because by the very nature of an irrational belief, if we believe it's a belief, then it, by definition, it's a truth. It's a truth we hold.
Yep.
I am not very academic. That's the truth. I don't like filling in forms when I go for interviews because I'm not very academic. The truth of the matter with myself is I'm dyslexic. That was the big dispute for me. It's not that I'm not academic. It's that for me, I'm dyslexic, and it wasn't picked up by my educators. It wasn't the time, I guess, that was recognized when I was at school. Therefore, I labeled myself as not being academic at all, and it held me back. It stopped me from going into any further learning until eventually I entered counseling and found a very patient, caring man called Rory. And was able to work with that and go, actually, I can do this. But up until then, it was unseen to me, Rory. It acted as a barrier in my life, but I wasn't able to see it. So I guess part of this is personal development. Maybe the challenge is look to self. What are the belief systems you hold? And could they be irrational beliefs? Are there beliefs that are holding you back?
Absolutely. And I think there's no better way of, checking that out than doing what I did. And, as I say, this sheet just starts off with, ask the question, what's your irrational belief? What do you believe, you cannot do. That's what my tutors told me. And what is a more rational thought? And it takes some thinking. You have to sit and think about it. I mean, cognitive behavioral therapy is about primarily thinking. It doesn't dismiss emotions, but cognitive means to think and behavior means to behave. So thinking changes behavior. And have a sit down. And it's it's amazing. You talk about the Facebook group, Ken, and if you want to join our Facebook group, you type in Counselling Tutor into Facebook. You'll find us. We're a closed group, but knock on the door and our friendly moderator will let you in. And you can join the thousands and thousands of like-minded people who are students, who are tutors, who are supervisors, who are qualified practitioners, all talking about issues and topics in the world of counselling and psychotherapy. And one of the interesting things that comes up again and again and again is this idea of I can't do it, I'm not bright enough, I'm not clever enough. And through the course of my work, I sometimes speak with members who say this, and I say, where did you get these ideas from? And lots of them come from school. Certainly, people of my generation and your generation, Ken, when dyslexia and neurodiversity wasn't seen in the same light it is now, would have gone away, thinking that they were less than or not able to. And just by looking at that and saying, well, actually. And one of the things that I've noticed through life is if you get someone who's very accomplished at something, when you think I couldn't do that, ask yourself the question, were they born that accomplished? And the answer probably is not. Yeah. And you say, well, how did they get there? And you find they got there by grafting and doing the work. Some people got there by other means, I have to say. We don't live in a fair world. But generally speaking, it's about, as we say in the north of England, in the UK, it's about graft. You put the work in, you get your head in the books, you visit, you do the work, and eventually you'll become competent at some level at something, and then you can develop it. And I think sometimes that's a bit missed. But if you are in that position, if you're listening at home and you're thinking, I can't do my studies or I'm struggling, just have a think about. Certainly my journey, because I left with virtually no qualifications when I left school, worth taking to an interview. And also that, we live in a world now that better understands neurodiversity and certain learning difficulties and can be very supportive. And hey, there's so much more information out there now than when we studied, Ken. I mean, the internet is packed with it. Our website's packed with it. Our Facebook's packed with it. So, just have a bit of a think. Yeah. As they say, being it's cognitive, have a bit of a think.
That's it. I think that it's that work on self. It's that self-reflection, looking what those irrational beliefs are for self. And yes, we've spoken about study or academic ability or age, but it can be anything. Our irrational beliefs are beliefs that we hold that in some way hold us back. Rory, when you were mentioning joining the Facebook group and how we've got the information on the website and all that, it reminds me of those that might say, oh, but I'm not very good with computers, or oh, I'm not very good with technology. And I like what you said that, Rory. Nobody is until you learn it. It's a skill. It's like anything else. Sometimes the barrier to overcoming an irrational belief is some CPD, some continuing professional development focused down in a certain area. Sometimes it's about challenging self and looking who we are. It's a really interesting topic. We've made a handout for you. It's one of Rory's super duper handouts on CBT and irrational belief. It's from an CBT interventions series that we have in our counseling study resource for our students. But you can get a free copy of this, and all you need to do is go to counsellingtutor.com. That's the website where Rory and I hang out. And we have all our podcasts on there. Just click on the podcast tab, make your way to episode 242. That's today's episode. And right there on that page, you'll be able to download the free handout on challenging your own irrational beliefs. So there you have it.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And, for those people who may be listening and thinking, I may be too old to study counselling, I will say to you, there's a man called Alan Shepard. It may not mean very much to anybody listening. Alan Shepard walked on the moon, a handful of people that walked on the moon, and he was 47 years old. 47 years old when he walked on the moon. So, if there are times when I think to myself, oh, I'm a bit old, I always look at Alan Shepard and I say to myself cognitively, I'm not going to the moon. I'm just doing this task.
So as we reverse out of our theory and practice, we now head forwards into our practice partner. And practice partner is an area where we kind of look at going into private practice, running a private practice, working with clients, gaining clients. And today we're going to be looking at inquiry to client booking. And I think this is a really important area to focus on. So we do the work in terms of maybe putting our listing on a counseling directory. We might have a website. We might have business cards out. We might have people referring through to us. So when a prospective client comes through, because that's what they are, and in marketing terms, it's called prospect, and it means prospective, not yet a client. How do we manage that? What can we do to kind of take them from being a prospective client to being a client, from being an inquiry to being a client that we can serve, if of course our skill set matches what they're looking for. And the place that I'd like to start, Rory, is the number one rule is to get back to people who inquire. And that might sound like an obvious thing, but when I was looking for my own personal therapy, when I was a student and I was on my journey and I needed to go and do my own personal therapy as part of my training, I was really surprised at how many people I reached out to, therapists that had taken the time and maybe even paid the money to list on a therapist directory, who never got back to me. They didn't even acknowledge that I'd reached out to them. Now, I admit that you may be full. Your practice may be full. You may not have any more space to take on any more clients. But even in that case, thinking of the person or where they might be when they're making that reach out, it can be a very, very vulnerable person. It can be a fragile process of, you know what, I've tried, I failed, I can't do this. I'm finally going to dare to reach out to somebody. And I wonder what that message might be received by that person if they don't hear anything back. If they call out into the darkness going, I need help, and they don't even hear back. So rule number one, even if you're full, even if you cannot see someone, is to get back, check your emails regularly, check the whatever roads you've built that are going to bring the inquiries in. Make sure you're looking at that on a regular basis in order to be able to recognize that person and start that conversation. And I guess it keys into the buying cycle, Rory.
It absolutely does, Ken. And I like what you say about vulnerable clients. That we're not talking about people who may be buying a bicycle here. We're talking about people who are in real distress, real emotional pain, could be real physical pain in some cases. And they're taking the courageous step of asking for help, which may be so difficult for some people. And they reach out, they send an email or they leave a voicemail and they hear nothing. Mm-hmm. And the consequence of that is that may even make them feel worse. Not even the therapist can be bothered to speak with me. And, you talked about your experience, Ken, when you trained. I had some therapy in 2019 and I contacted 3 therapists. One never got back to me. One got back to me about three weeks later and said, oh, sorry about that. I was on holiday. I hope you enjoyed your holiday. And one of them phoned me back literally that day. There was a nice recording that said, I'm not available at the moment, but, your call's important. Please leave your name and your details, and I'll come back to you. And she did. And I have to say thank you, Helen, if you're listening. If Helen's listening, thank you, Helen. And she came back, and that was the beginning of forming a therapeutic relationship. And it's so important. And even now, I still have on my email an autoresponder. So if someone emails my practice and I'm not about, could be 3:00 in the morning, they get a automated response. Now, it did say, thank you very much for contacting me. I'm not available at the moment, but I will get back to you within 24 hours. Nowadays, because I don't practice as much, and my list is closed, it says, thank you for reaching out. I'm afraid that I'm fully booked at the moment, and gives a link to a website which people can choose therapists. And in fact, very few people email me now because I don't advertise my services. So it's really, really important that first contact is done, and the follow up needs to be, I think, equally as sensitive and equally as professional, Ken.
Yeah, very much so. And so we're kind of starting with that. You've gone through all the work, all the expense of generating inquiries coming in. We need to be responding to those, and sometimes it's not from a purposeful point from the therapist. It can be, and this is specific with. It's more likely to happen from a directory listing. It can be that the inquiry goes into your spam folder. Certain email service providers will trigger certain messages to go into spam folders. So we may not even see that a client has reached out to us. So it is really good practice to check your spam folder on a regular basis. It is really good practice if you have a telephone number that is registered with your practice, that if you're not able to answer that as you did, Rory, that there is an answer message on there that the person can hear, that you might get back to them or suggest other ways that you may get hold of you. So let's take it a step further now. So we're saying from inquiry to client. So you're saying, Rory, so we are now getting back to the person who is making inquiry. What is it that we do? What is that next step? And of course, we need to walk gently. What we're not in counseling and psychotherapy is salespeople. We don't ever want to be salespeople. We don't want to be coming across as salespeople. So I think it's about thinking from the same perspective we would when we're in a session with a client. We want to be empathic and we want to be in their frame of reference. So if somebody is reaching out for therapy, it may well be that they might say, I'm thinking of going into therapy. I'm wondering how much your session fees are. That's just an example that I'm giving here. And I wonder, would it be a good fit to go, well, it's so much for an hour, and if you book 6 sessions, then it's so much. That doesn't feel, for me, respectful of where that client might really be coming from. So it's about maybe thinking about what your reply is, maybe speaking about who you are, how you work, what you work with, maybe offering an initial session free of charge so you can check whether you are a fit for that person, and also taking into consideration that somebody reaching out may be reaching out to a number of different therapists. And we mentioned this in our previous practice partners, that there is competition, that it's the truth of the matter. Specifically, if you're on a directory, you are there with hundreds, if not thousands, of other therapists that this client may be able to choose from, specifically if you're working doing online therapy. So it's not geographically locked into your town or city. There may be choice there, and that choice is going to be made by the client, for me, based on the best fit for them, based firstly on somebody who's going to get back to them. So out of the 3, Rory, only 1 got back to you, 1 far too late. You were already in therapy by that stage. Getting back to them, and then having something in your copy, in what you write in your email, that kind of explains who you are, warmly recognizes where that person is when they're reaching out, maybe offering a free introductory session so you can check your fit, your competence levels are a good match for that client. I think that's a good starting point on that, Rory.
Absolutely. And a couple of things that can be kind of rookie errors. First of all, if someone phones you up, say in a session, and you notice that there's been a phone call, but they've not left a message, don't phone the number back, because they could be sat in the office, they could be sat on the bus, they could be sat with their partner, And that, in some cases, it could be quite dangerous to phone someone back who's not left a message, because they may be with an abusive partner who says, "Who's that?"
Yeah.
And that could be it. So, as a rule of thumb, I only phone people back if they've left a message, and hopefully, in my I used to have on my answer phone, please give a time that is convenient for me to contact you. So that's a bit of a prompt for the client to say, "Well, I'm okay at 4 o'clock. Please give me a ring at 4 o'clock." And at 4 o'clock they feel comfortable. And I think also it's a case of, one of the things we know, the research is clear, is the relationship is a big part of the curative factor of therapy. And offering a half an hour meeting just to see if you're a good fit, because a lot of people, and I think myself included, would struggle maybe with a picture or just a voice on the phone. It's nice to meet someone, isn't it? Especially when you're going to be talking about maybe very difficult stuff, very personal, very, sometimes for clients, very embarrassing things. And I think offering a free half-hour meeting can be very useful. Client can gauge if you're the person for them. You can gauge if you're working within your competence. And at the end of it, you can say, okay, you have a think about it, or if you want, you can book an appointment with me. And, I found that the majority of the people I've done that with have said, "Oh, no, I'm happy with that. Yes, let's book in." But I think you're right, Ken. It's not like buying a bicycle or a loaf of bread. Therapy is a lot more than that. And yes, we need to make a living. Certainly in the times we find ourselves in now. But also we need to make sure that the client is comfortable with who they've chosen. And I think the half an hour meeting is pretty much essential in my view.
Yeah, and I guess you need to look at your practice and see if it is a fit for you, and if you wish to follow that model. But it's certainly, I subscribe to what you've just said there, Rory. I certainly offered that in my own practice. And then comes the question of what happens in that 30-minute introductory session. And we need to tread once again really carefully when we go into that 30-minute introductory session. So we might offer that, and the prospective client may go, "Okay, yeah, I'm gonna come and see you and see if we are a fit." Because at the end of the day, the research shows us that the relationship is so important in the outcome of therapy at the end. So you want to feel good with that client. You want that client to feel good with you. You want to make sure your competence matches what their presentation is, as a ethical matter, and of course because we do this because we want the outcomes for the clients. But what we don't want to be doing is having a mini 30-minute counseling session to show them what a counseling session is like, because we can't do that. It is not ethical. We're not contracted with this person. We haven't built any rapport. We don't have the trust base in place. They are not protected by a contract. We are not protected by a contract. So what we're not looking to do in that first session is have a mini session. So within that first session, we might open it up by saying, this is not really a counseling session. This is just an opportunity for us to meet, for me to tell you about who I am and how I work. I'd be interested in knowing what it is that you're looking to get out of therapy. So you're looking for the presenting issue there. And we have to tread carefully that, we've all seen this. If you've been in practice for any length of time, you've seen the client who will come in and you say, "Hello, welcome, it's great to see you." And they just kind of immediately start offloading material that they've been carrying. And it's no wonder, they just want to get it out. And within therapy, we would kind of try to slow that down so that we could contract and outline what therapy is about. And the same is true in that initial session. Even more so, we want to put a break on that. We want to actually stop the client going into any sensitive material that is going to leave that client maybe feeling open and vulnerable at the end of that session, because we don't have the time to close up with that session. with the client, because it isn't a counselling session. So I might start it by saying, this is not a counselling session. This is an opportunity for us to meet, to see if we feel a good fit for one another, for you to ask any questions that you may have about me or my therapy or my qualifications or the way that I work, and for me to find out what it is that you're looking to get. And the reason we look for that is just to make sure it matches our competence, that we're not going to be working with outside of our area of competence. And if we are, we will let them know. And you might even say that at the beginning of the meeting, I will ask you what you're looking to present. And if I find that falls outside of my training or my area of competence, I'll certainly let you know. And I may be able to kind of point you in a direction, as you did, Rory, with your emails of giving them a link to somewhere else. And then there's the opportunity to explore, be empathic, be warm, be yourself within that introductory session. We would cover our fees in that session. We would cover our availability in that session. We would cover our modality within that session of how we work. And there's nothing wrong with, at the end, and I certainly did this, I would suggest to clients that contacted me for that initial session, I would say to them, I really highly recommend that you reach out to other therapists as well and speak to them, because at the end of the day, therapy is based on that relationship, and you want somebody that you feel you can work with. We're in this to serve. Yes, we need clients. We need to, I guess, earn a living from our private practice, but first and foremostly, we're here to serve. And we want that client not to feel pressured, not to feel that now at the end of that session, they have to sign up. One of the things I did within my sessions that you can use or not use is I would get to the end and I would say, I want you to go away now and have a think about what we've talked about. And if you feel that we're a fit, you can get back in contact with me by email or whatever the preferred method was at the time, and we can take that further. They got the information. I would sometimes have a client going, no, I know you're the right fit for me. I want to book with you. And I would still say, that's fine, but go away anyway and have a think. And then if you're still sure about that, get back to me. And I did that as kind of a little break so that the person didn't feel that they were pressured in the moment, that I've got this person in front of me, so I have to say yes. I have to say that I like what this person has said, Rory.
Yeah, I like that, Ken. Very ethical, very thoughtful. And I also, I mean, I totally agree with what you've said, and think that's a wonderful way of working. I also think that with private therapy, people are paying per hour, a fee per hour, whatever that fee is. And when they come and they tell you what the presenting issue is, I think it's good practice for therapists to think about how many sessions it may take to work through this. Because if they're paying per hour, and I may say to someone, what you brought seems to you, very, 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 very powerful, and it may take, from my experience, a few sessions to unpack that, and say, maybe we look at 6 sessions first and see how far. Look at part of it, because I think that if you're buying anything else, if you're saying, can you build me a wall, they would tell you how long it would take and how much it was going to cost. They wouldn't say, oh yes, well, we'll come and we'll do 1 brick and then come next week and we'll do another brick. They would a builder would tell you how much. They would give you an estimate. That's what I'm struggling for. They would give you an estimate. And I think that that's something that we need to think about where possible with clients, because if people are paying, there cannot be anything worse, I don't think, than them kind of coming to a point where they can't afford to pay and there's still work to be done. So I think it's about being really thoughtful as a therapist and thinking about what can be addressed in the time, and to be very realistic, the money the client's got.
Yeah, definitely. And it empowers the client that they're able to take something away. And maybe the takeaway from this episode is for you to have a think about your journey from an inquiry to client. What does that look like? What does it entail? And if you do offer an introductory session, maybe it's worth writing down what you do covering that and kind of having a bit of a framework, maybe even a framework that you can share with the client. You know, I'd like to invite you for an introductory session where we're going to look at A, B, C, D, and E, and where you might lay out what that is. And we want to be respectful and in service of the client, as we know. And what you said, Rory, so very, very important. There's nothing that would be sadder for me as a therapist than a client coming in not having any knowledge of therapy, and why would they have knowledge of therapy? They don't know how long it would take. You know, there's certain presentations that you'll know from your experience that certain presentations you can work on for years. They really are deep-seated. And you know, how sad would it be if that client got to a point where they were struggling to be able to afford it, but feeling that they needed to come back? You know, so giving that estimation, very, very important. It's a good topic, this, and I like this this section on practice partner, Rory. And you said something right in the beginning, which I think will be a great topic as we kind of go forward. You said that when people get in contact with you via email, you had an autoresponder on. Now that's that we're talking tech there.
Yeah,
and I think that as we go forward, we're now looking at that client journey. We're looking at the inquiry to a booked client. As we go forward in this section of the podcast, we will be touching on the technologies that we use as counselors, as therapists, to run our practice, right from websites, which has already been covered, ways of working with email and automatically replying to emails, and of course note-taking, storage, all of the day-to-day running of a practice, invoicing, chasing up on invoicing, measuring the effectiveness of your practice. So you were saying, Rory, that when people would reach out to you and you would offer that introductory session, that a high proportion would then feel that it was a fit and re-engage with you. And certainly within my practice, I measured what that was, and mine was around 80%. So out of 10 people that would come for an introductory session, around about 8 of them would engage with me. I don't remember the exact number now, but I was tracking, and it's pretty easy to track. And we'll be covering all of those topics and more as we go forward as your practice partner in this section.
Yes, and I'd agree with you that the moving into private practice is something that's hardly touched on in first trainings, and needs a lot of consideration. And also, as we're seeing in these episodes, Ken, there's so many moving parts to it. There's so many moving parts.
Yeah. So there you have it. That is Practice Partner. We're now going into Practice Matters. In Practice Matters, we look at an element that we may come across in practice. And this is certainly a really, really important topic. And we have just updated this topic in our CPD library. Now, the CPD library is for qualified practitioners, and we cover elements of CPD training that are in service of our clients. And this is all about pre-trial therapy. And I'll share, Rory, when I was on my placement, I found myself heading into, and I'm very glad I didn't go into, heading into what was going to end up being a court case. And I'm very glad that that didn't go there, because I think if it did, I was not prepared for it. I hadn't done the training in my core training. This is a real specialist area, and we have to tread incredibly carefully, Rory, with pre-trial therapy.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, one of the joys of my work when I reach out to interview people is to interview people who are compassionate, caring, and are really wanting to change the canvas for clients. And one such person is Erene Hadjiioannou, who has been absolutely instrumental in working with the government, I think it was the Home Office, in changing the procedures and the practices of how one works with a client who may be in pre-trial therapy. And in May of 2022, the guidance changed. So there's some new guidance. And Irene has done an absolutely fantastic lecture on what that guidance is and how to apply it. And I caught up with her, and she talked about the changes and how they impact on therapists. And this is what she had to say. And we welcome back Erene Hadjiioannou, who we heard from in January 2022, episode 215, I think. And Erene talked about pre-trial guidance. And at that time, there was a discussion about it changing, and it has changed. So first of all, a very warm welcome, Erene. Thank you for coming back and sharing the information with us.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for having me again.
So what's changed? We talked about the guidance changing in May of 2022. So what is this change? How will it affect therapists?
Yeah, the previous guidelines had been in place for 20 years, so a very long time. There were two sort of main issues that were raised by them. The first was the inclusion of a clause that stated that a victim of a crime couldn't talk about their lived experiences, as we would call it, the details of the crime, as the criminal justice system would call it, in therapy with a therapist, and that was intended to protect their evidence. That clause has now been removed, which enables clients to speak freely, regardless of whether or not they're going through the criminal justice process at the time that we are working with them. What remains and what's important for therapists is the possible request for our clinical notes as a form of what the criminal justice system calls third-party evidence. And obviously we can go through really what that means for therapists in our conversation today.
Yes, I mean that seems to be a big movement in pre-trial therapy, that clients can speak freely about what's going on for them, because I know that in my experience of being a therapist, having to kind of effectively audit a client and saying to them, well, we can speak about this, but we can't speak about that, can be very difficult and also not particularly practical, because clients may very well speak about it anyway.
Yeah, and also we're literally delivering talking therapy. People expect, it's a reasonable expectation that you'd be able to talk. So yes, practically very difficult for both therapist and client. And unfortunately, often in the past, this would lead clients to be forced to choose between talking therapy or reporting. And yeah, in terms of service provision, it would be very difficult for clients to really get what they needed. And if we're talking about the impact of silence on somebody that has been brave enough to speak out and ask for support, obviously that can be at worst re-traumatizing. So yes, the removal of that particular clause, I think, is a success. It's a step in the right direction.
Yes, it's very welcome, isn't it? And you alluded to third-party evidence and therapists may be asking for their notes. What do we need to know about that as therapists? What's useful?
Okay. Firstly, there's very explicit mention in the updated pretrial therapy guidelines that notes from therapists should only be sought, requested, considered to be used as third-party evidence under what's called a reasonable line of inquiry rather than speculatively. And I think that's a really important move, in part because it's already an intrusion to a client's confidentiality and privacy. It's an inclusion into the therapeutic process by the criminal justice system if their private confidential information, i.e. their notes, are sort of shared as part of their reporting process. So what that means in practice is that a legal professional can't ask for our notes and just to browse through them just in case something is relevant. That's a speculative inquiry. So under a reasonable line of inquiry, for example, the client would have mentioned the crime or their lived experience that they've gone through with their therapist. So that's one example there.
Yes, and just to clear something up, do we have to give our notes up if asked for by our colleagues in the police?
We are able to refuse that request as therapists. Our clients are able to refuse that request. Obviously, that's assessed according to other sort of legal guidance and policies within the criminal justice system. What's really helpful with the revised pretrial therapy guidelines is that there is a separate section that's called accompanying notes for therapists that gives us really specific information about how notes are handled. That includes a flow chart. I myself, in having had to revise my sort of pre-trial contract, have included that flowchart just for transparency of information, because obviously there's a lot that goes on within the criminal justice process, and it can be really daunting, it can be really stressful. So I think that the least we can do as therapists is just provide our clients with information so they feel reassured at a very stressful time.
Absolutely. And you alluded to the contract. This is important, isn't it? That when we're thinking about pretrial therapy, that there is a contract in place. What kind of things would you put in your contract to support and help the client make an informed choice?
Yeah, I should say as well that as part of answering that question, one thing that should be in your contract is that if a judge issues a court order for your notes, we don't have a choice in whether or not to release them. But for example, if a barrister or somebody within the CPS or the police request our notes, then we have more flexibility there. But that, of course, needs to be justified in some way. So those details are helpful to have in our contract. That enables clients to make informed decisions, be aware of the choices that they might have in the process. What is really helpful and really should be really clearly stated in our contract as well is that it's always the client's choice whether or not to access therapy, when they access therapy, and also what type of therapy that they choose to access. And that's stated in the revised pretrial therapy guidelines too.
Yes, it's a whole thing, isn't it? When we approach client work, we approach it holistically. And in terms of working with clients who may have gone through traumatic experiences or may be deciding to disclose what's happened to them to law enforcement, we really need to provide a whole service to them, which includes I'm thinking about the reality of what might happen. We speak to them and we say, okay, this is what I can do. This is what might happen. Do you think it's important that we have those conversations with clients?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from an ethical perspective, we are always seeking our clients' consent to proceed. So yes, transparency is just coming from an ethical standpoint. I would also be clear with clients that in types of other evidence that we might be asked to provide, that includes the potential of being called to court as a witness. In practice, this happens very rarely, but it is a possibility. And I would also say, in terms of revisions to the pretrial therapy guidelines, previously group therapy wasn't permitted. It is permitted now, but in terms of the wording of it, it still seems like a grey area. I think, unfortunately, a little bit of a hangover of that concern of if a victim is in a group, perhaps listening to other people's stories, that might change their account of what happened. But obviously, in terms of how we would see it as therapists, people's subjective narratives do change over the course of therapy, and from a trauma-informed perspective, that's helpful, because part of what's traumatic is that your narrative is very fixed, so you end up just reliving the same thing. That's not to say that so actually, if somebody's account of what happened becomes a bit more flexible and actually gets processed in a certain way, that's really helpful. I think my opinion is that there's unnecessary concerns from the criminal justice process as to what's the risk if somebody actually talks about what happens. I think continuing silence around somebody's lived experiences just prolongs trauma, which is why that kind of main clause of you can't talk about it if you've reported, again, is a really good thing to not be there anymore.
I mean, yes, that's excellent news. I know that you've been at the part of the forefront of changing, the whole pre-trial therapy environment and, working, with the law enforcement, the government, I guess, ultimately, to try and alter and modify their guidance. What else do you think is needed to be done? Is there anything else that would be helpful to clients? What's the next step?
I think that therapists have a lot of power, and we should advocate for and with our clients. I've obviously tried to do that in my own way, but there's many of us out there, and I think there's strength in numbers. So for anybody listening, I would encourage you to take action if you feel that that's within your capacity, because I think what happens on the ground is that therapists completely understandably get very anxious about working pre-trial, and I've heard recent examples of still advising clients to not really go into the detail of their lived experiences, even though they are allowed to speak freely, because there are very real concerns about how that might be used against them within the legal process. But the ways that we can protect our clients is in very diligent note-taking, and also in just contracting really thoroughly, and that's the best that we can do for our clients. They shouldn't continue to be restricted for speaking out and asking for help. I think there's ways that we can work for and with them in order to enable them to access therapy as they would reasonably expect to.
Yeah, absolutely. We mustn't let our anxiety get in the way of helping the clients, and I think that can sometimes happen with colleagues. They may hear the word trial, law, police, and that might just kind of shut the therapist down. And you know, do you think it's important that we really look at all this information and inform ourselves so that we don't go down the road of maybe auditing ourselves and therefore our clients?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have an ethical requirement to follow any legal guidance that applies to any of our client group. And what I should add as well, in case people aren't aware, is that these guidelines are applicable to any victim of any crime that we might work with. In practice, they seem to be disproportionately applied to survivors of sexual and domestic violence. So again, in terms of pushing back against sort of the injustice and the silence that this client group really faces anyway, for us to just, again, be well informed that actually if somebody discloses sexual violence, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's just them that might need to be subject to these guidelines.
Yes. In summary, I welcome review and change in the service of clients, and for, I guess, our profession to take hold of that and to actively build it into our practices, to be knowledgeable about pretrial therapy, knowledgeable about the changes. I hope the people who are listening to this will be eagerly finding out about that information, and not being frightened of working with a client who may end up going to court.
Yeah, and I think abiding by these guidelines also means respecting their decision to report, because that's a big thing as well. And fear, anxiety, stress, worry can make us, sort of fall into a place where we might have a knee-jerk reaction. So, I've had a request for notes, that's really stressful. What do I do about it? As you would with anything else, speak to your client, have conversations about it in the same way that you would manage kind of breaking confidentiality for any other reason. So you maintain that collaborative process, you provide sort of empowerment and choice as much as you can within the terms of the guidelines. And you are allowed, and you and your client are allowed to take time to think about what to do next. That's absolutely fine. So yes, that would, if you take anything away from this, I would, just sort of advise that really.
Are there any other changes in the new guidance?
Yeah, one thing that's important for therapists to be aware of is, and I think is a general point in managing confidentiality, where we have to assess what information is appropriate to be released. Previously, with the prior sort of original pretrial therapy guidelines, we sometimes had the option of writing a summary report rather than releasing our notes as is. And that was helpful in sort of from that confidentiality perspective of only releasing kind of the necessary and minimum amount of information that we could do. With the revised guidelines, we don't have the option of writing a summary report. Our notes have to be released as is, which I would say highlights that point of just very diligent note taking on the part of therapists.
Yes, that has been that is quite a significant change. You can no longer pre-see the notes; they have to be sent as is. Just send your notes along. I think that's really important for therapists to understand, because I know a lot of therapists may very well, I was taught when I was in college you could write a pre-see and send it off, but obviously that's now changed. Well, I think that's a fine takeaway to end this interview. Erene Hadjiioannou, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Big thank you to Irene. A big thank you to you, Rory, for holding that interview. Such an important topic. And if you would like to listen to the entire lecture, that is available in the Counsellor CPD library. And to find out more information of how to join that, if you're not already a member, go to counsellingtutor.com. All the information is right there on the homepage of the website. And it just leaves to say that this has been episode 242 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast.
Yes, we started off with theory and practice, CBT and irrational beliefs, where I shared my very young self and my own irrational beliefs, and well, the rest is history. We moved into practice partner, which is inquiry into client booking, and Ken and myself spoke about how to engage with clients who first come to your practice, and some ideas in how to make their journey as pain-free and as thoughtful as possible. And finally, in Practice Matters, I caught up with Erene Hadjiioannou, who has altered the canvas on pretrial therapy and the procedures that therapists need to undertake. And she gave us a fantastic interview on that. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.